Okay, welcome one and all to Publishers Panel Between the Covers. Take that as you will. Yeah. I'm Sawad Hussain. I'm an Arabic to English literary translator who is merely and humbly moderating the panel today of our superstars from the publishing industry, which I will allow them to introduce themselves, namely so that I don't mess up any pronunciations of names. And then we will jump into some questions. We will run to about 2:40, and so while they're talking, if there's anything that pops into your mind and you want to ask about afterwards, please make a note of it because we will have ample time for questions and answers. And ideally, when you have a question, you can keep it open or you could direct it to a specific editor. I leave that up to you. And away we go. Yeah, okay.
Everyone, nice to see so many of you today. I am Dredhëza Maloku, and I'm the editor at Daunt Books Publishing. So I kind of commission across literary fiction and non-fiction, and also books in translation. And we're a very small team with just 4 of us, and 2 of us acquiring. So, yeah.
Hello, I'm Ansa Khattak, and I'm editorial director at Scepter, where I commission mostly literary fiction, but some literary narrative non-fiction. Before that, I was at Picador for 8 years and spent a year at Penguin Random House in between.
Hi, I'm Tasja Dorkofikis, and I set up, together with some publishing friends, a small publishing house, Linden Editions, which was set up this year. Before, I worked for Portobello Books and Granta, acquiring both literary fiction and fiction in translation and some non-fiction. And before that, I worked as the publicity director for the literary side. I think the part of Random House that's now vintage. So I used to do Cape, Chatto, Harville, and I worked on translated fiction there as well. And I also worked at the Arts Council doing promoting translation.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm so happy to have each of you here, as I'm sure all of the translators out in the audience are as well. I have some pre-planned questions, and this is the only question where I'm actually going to ask each of our panelists to respond to, which is, what were the last 2 titles you have acquired to be translated, and where or how did you find them? Yeah, if we could start with Dredhëza, please.
I'll start. So my last 2, I'll start with the first one. It's a title called Bait, and it's by a Uruguayan author, and it came to me kind of via a more traditional route from a literary agent who submitted me an 8-page sample translation, and which is not very long, but because our publicist speaks Spanish, she was able to read the full manuscript and kind of affirm that the book itself is excellent as well as the translation, because it's, sometimes 8 pages is not enough, but in this instance they were really excellent and I was really excited by it. So with those 2 things together, she wrote a report for me and I pitched it to our sales team and then had the go-ahead to acquire it. So that's coming out next year in June, and I'm editing it as we speak.
Sorry, did you say it's called Baked?
Bait,
okay.
Like B-A-I-T.
Like fish bait.
Yeah, like
okay.
fish, yeah.
Or clickbait, yeah.
Exactly. And I was excited to find something, by a Uruguayan writer too. There's a lot of Spanish translated fiction out there, but I feel like not as much from Uruguay that I've personally come across. It's set in like a fictional fishing village in Uruguay, but it could be anywhere kind of in that region. It's really brilliant. And then the second book is called Cosmos. It's by a Danish writer, and this one came to me in kind of a roundabout way in that I'm signed up to the Danish Arts Council kind of newsletter, and it was mentioned in one of their roundups of the most exciting books in Denmark at the moment, and it's like an epistolary novel, kind of a love story as well, written by kind of an immigrant is writing WhatsApp messages to his family back home, and falls in love with someone, and his whole world is kind of rocked by that. And then So I reached out to the agent in the UK and asked if the rights were available, which they were, so offered for that and kind of was up against someone else and happily won that one. And it's coming out next year in July. And yeah, it's that one I'm also in the process of editing, so it's still very fresh. But yeah, those are kind of the two. They're both quite short, like I'd say like literary novellas, essentially.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoy the origin stories of translations, and especially because you mentioned the Arts Council, the Danish Arts Council newsletter. Sometimes we think nobody reads those sorts of things, but it's like, wow, actually someone's reading them. So yeah, definitely keep, putting those sorts of titles in your releases. Ansa, please. Yeah.
Yep. So the last two titles that I bought to be translated have quite different origin stories. I bought a novel by a Spanish writer called Marta Pérez Carbonell called Nada más y Osorio, which will have the English title I Made You Up in My Head. And I bought that after it came in on submission from a Spanish agent. And that was, at the time, we had the Spanish text, which I could read, and there might have been some material available in English. I must have had something to put in front of sales and go see. But I read the Spanish text and thought that it was incredible. And then it sold in Spain to Lumen, brilliant publisher, and then sold in the US to Riverhead. So that was really nice to kind of buy it so early in the book's Genesis. And then more recently, I bought a title translated from Simple Chinese called Women Seated, and it's by an author called Zhang Yuran. She's an incredibly lauded writer in China, and by the time I bought that actually Riverhead are publishing in the US again, and the rights team at Riverhead sent me the English language translation by Jeremy Tiang, and I read it and thought it was brilliant, and we bought it only a few months before it's coming out in the US. It's coming out in the US next month. So by the time we bought it, there was already an English translation. There was already a US cover. There were already some incredible quotes. So yeah, two very different stages.
Okay. And have you published Chinese titles in translation before?
No, never.
Okay. So pitching it to your team, were there any concerns from your team about having a language that your team hasn't published before?
No, I think we tend to make the decision based on the text, based on the pitch. Sort of when you get to I know we're going to talk about acquisitions meetings later, but when you get to that point, it's more about okay, do we think this is brilliant? Can we publish it? The fact that where it's from is important to the story. It's about a nanny who's working for a very wealthy Beijing family. It starts as a kidnapping plot and then features the family falling out of disgrace. To me, it read like a kind of opening episode of 24 or something like that. It was.
I love 24.
Yeah, I know. So it was just so I was just so immediately grabbed. So I suppose the interesting point is the cultural and national setting is so necessary to the plot and crucial and makes sense and part of what makes it fascinating. But we reacted first and foremost to it as a brilliant story.
Right. No, that's really comforting to hear. I think sometimes translators working from languages which aren't the usual suspects, sometimes I think we can get into our heads thinking that, an editor's not familiar with the language that we're pitching or the culture or, the publishing landscape and might be a bit, not as confident or thinking that maybe editors might not be open to it. So it's very encouraging to hear this, that was your first time translating Chinese, and it didn't have anything to do with the language really, but just the text speaking to you. Thank you. And Tasja, yes.
In our case, it's a different story because we just started and we are we're publishing books in translation only. And initially we thought that we wanted our books, our first books, we wanted to be able to read them in the original or in some form, or maybe in translation, but we wanted to read the whole text. So our first book, which came out in March, was from Polish, and I read Polish. and it was called Voracious, by Małgorzata Lebda and translated by Antonia Lloyd-Jones, who's doing
Who's here somewhere?
yeah, who is here somewhere. And this book came to me directly from the Polish publisher, whom I knew from before. So from my Portobello years, when I was, so I used to publish books that they were doing then. And Antonia, at the same time, read that book and said, "This book is amazing." And we both thought, "This book is amazing." And we loved the language. I thought it was really fresh. It was stylistically unusual. And it's a debut novel in Polish. So it was quite a big risk in terms of, at that point it was doing very, very well in Poland, but there were no other foreign sales yet. So this was a big risk, but I loved that book, Antonia loved that book, so we felt that it made complete sense to start with that. And then the book that we acquired recently, the latest book, is Ilaria by Gabriela Zalapi, which is translated by Adriana Hunter. And I saw that book because I also work for an international book festival in Switzerland, which I program. And I saw Gabriela at one of our festivals, and then I saw that suddenly her book was appearing everywhere in bookshops, and it was doing very well in France. So I got interested and asked Geraldine, my partner, to read it in French. She loved it, then I read it in French. I loved it, and then it turned out that it was already sold in English to other press in America. So we then bought rights from America. So in a way, we sort of scouted it out ourselves, and then we thought, we want to publish it, and then we found out who's got the rights. So it was a sort of slightly roundabout way of doing it, and but then it's lovely because then the English text is ready so much earlier when you're doing it with a partner in the States, that you have the lead time is easier in this case for us. So we're publishing it next January 26.
Okay, thank you. Is that quite common that you are acquiring books that have been bought by U.S. houses, or do you find that it's also reciprocal? Like, a lot of American houses are buying books that each of your houses have already bought rights to. Is it quite balanced, or does America tend to kind of buy the rights first?
I would say it really varies. Like I've seen both cases. I mean, there are some American publishers, places like Harper Villa, that often buy things very early, particularly from Spanish. But then, obviously, there are some publishers here in the UK, somewhere like Harville, that might buy something really early. So, reciprocal, I would say.
Yeah, and because, again, we are new, I started talking to various small American publishing houses quite early on, and we were thinking about publishing things together. So if I find something that I like, I talk to them straight away, and vice versa. Which that doesn't mean that we've succeeded yet to publish together, but there is that conversation that we pass the information to each other.
Yeah, that's lovely. The door is open. Okay, moving on to our next question. What is the greatest misconception about being an editor or a publisher of literature in translation?
Well, it's difficult. I mean, because I've been working. I mean, it's for the general public, I guess, and that this has been changing dramatically. There used to be this theory that it's difficult, that it's niche and it's difficult. But I think with the popularity of Netflix and lots of foreign films with subtitles, it's no longer the case.
Yeah.
And also the books in translation are now appearing everywhere in a bookshop, not only necessarily on separate tables. So I think that's probably no longer a problem. I think, and there is a very hungry market out there. I mean, people want to read books in translation, so yeah. So I think that sort of difficult niche is probably disappearing now.
Kind of,
slowly.
yeah, eroding.
Eroding, yeah.
Okay.
I had an answer to this,
Yes.
but have just thought of something else as well.
Yeah, please.
Well, I think the first thing is I think there's sometimes an assumption that there's in UK publishing, I think it's much less common to find people who are multilingual. So I've come across it both ways, both an assumption that you don't speak the language, that you haven't read the original.
Yeah.
But then I also think there is an assumption that to publish something, you must have read the original, which is obviously not the case.
Yeah.
You just talked about languages that I don't speak. But the other thing I was thinking of was, in terms of audience, just following on from what Tasja was saying, thinking about the article the bookseller published a while ago about the audience for translated fiction being younger than the general literary reader and also more male than the general literary reader. So maybe there's something there about assuming that we know who buys books in translation, and actually there's something surprising there too.
Yeah, there was that article released by the Booker Foundation about, I think many of us have read that, yeah, the average age of the reader in literary translation. But yes, just came to me as well. I mean, Butter won the best, is it called British book or book? Best book of the year in Britain. Yeah, I mean, it was up against all, non-translated titles as well. So I think that's definitely saying something. And I wasn't paid to say that, but I think you should read the book. Yeah. Okay, moving on. And this is also, I'm asking, a lot of the times, when I was asked to do this panel by Anna, I was so excited because I wanted to bring editors that I would like to get to know more, and also hoping that each of you would too. But I also want to know, for example, what are the best practices of translators that you appreciate? Because I think that, we all would love to know what you value in your relationship with translators so that we can do more of it. Yeah.
Kind of as with any relationship in this industry, transparency and communication goes a long way, especially because with translation, there are even more people involved. You have the author of the original text, and then you have the agent, but they're often more in the kind of background once you've acquired it, and then the editor, and then the translator, and it's kind of this, this three-pronged process, and it varies so much from book to book and relationship between author and translator each time, and also the level of the author's English as well, on how much they want to be involved. So at the point of acquisition, I kind of try and establish like my relationship to the translator and figure out if they've spoken to the author before and kind of talked about the text with them and about their translation before coming to me or not. And then we kind of have a very open line of communication about the process going forwards. And so it's so case by case, but often, for example, we published Elisa Schuer-Dussavan, the Swiss-Korean writer, and she and her translator, she's had the same translator for the last 4 books, and they're really close now, and they will work on the English translation together before I see it. So then the translator comes to me, and we kind of do the editing up until the copy edit process, and actually the author trusts us to just do that.
Who is the translator?
It's Anisa Abbas Higgins.
Oh, okay, yes.
Yeah. And she's brilliant, and she kind of has Elisa's voice down amazingly now. But for kind of newer books and translators I haven't worked with before, I really appreciate in their kind of first draft if they've left margin comments about certain, even if I can't kind of, for the Danish book, for example, the translators kept in some of his kind of thoughts or questions around wording in English, but he's kept in the Danish word that he's considered. And although I can't speak Danish, I find it really fascinating to just kind of see his thought process in the margins. And it's as much a kind of creative collaboration as anything else. And it makes it feel so much more intimate and exciting, I think, when you can see the way that they've kind of thought through a sentence, or even if you can't read the original language.
I'm just speechless. I was not expecting to hear that. Is that something both of you would also value, is comments in the margins from translators?
Yeah, especially, I guess it's about communication.
I'm just like, wow. Yeah.
Because it's sometimes you think something reads weirdly, but the moment you have that in comments and it's explained why it reads weirdly, and then you'll be convinced. So I think it's that sort of open communication that whenever the translator has doubts, it's quite useful to know, because we can talk to them about that, or it will sort of save the time as well, because we won't be correcting it back into, reading perfectly, but actually not what the author would have intended in a way. Mm-hmm. So I think it is very, very helpful, and and also good notes for copy editor at the end of the translation, so that we know what to expect, and then we know the voice. And what we are doing as well with Linden, we asked our translators to write an afterword. So every translator does an afterword for the book, and actually they're really useful almost at the very beginning for people to, whenever they start working with the book, for the copy editor, for the proofreader, and also for the sales team, because they explain the doubts, and also explain the fascination that the translator had with the book.
They would be fascinating to read.
They're really lovely to read. Yes, I thought it was a good idea to do that. And,
Wonderful. That's something I'm going to actively now incorporate into my translations, but I'll make sure not to veer and give too much of a side commentary throughout. Okay. I'm curious to know what happens at your house after a translator submits the manuscript. Is it edited in-house or otherwise? How do you decide who edits the manuscript? And do you try to get someone familiar with the source language to edit the text?
So once the translator has submitted the full manuscript, so normally you would have seen a sample beforehand. Exceptions to that, I suppose, could be if you've worked with that translator before, or they've worked with the author before, so it's sort of an unnecessary step. But when you receive the whole manuscript, I would read it once through, and then if I was the person who commissioned it, I would be the person who edited it.
Okay.
When I have been in other jobs where if I've been working in a support role to a commissioning editor, I've edited a translation that person's commissioned, but it would definitely be somebody in-house on the editorial team, in my experience. I have not encountered a scenario where you would send it to somebody who was familiar with the source language for review, and I think by that point, by the time the translation is delivered, you've really established the relationship of trust between you and the translator. I think that it can get really tricky if you start going from, as the editor, doing the line edit, start going from the translation to the source text, even if you speak the language, because obviously a translation is a cohesive work that's a product of someone's, translation project.
Right.
So diving back into the source language can be really difficult. So I would take it on its own terms, and then only in exceptional circumstances go back to the original text to look at something. And then, it would be the kind of line edit collaborative process that Dredhëza was talking about, which is so enjoyable. It's such a, because so much of the editing we do with other work, you're looking at all sorts of things while you're also looking on the line. You're moving things around, is this ending, delivering? But with translations, you can really, when they come in English, you can really focus on the line and focus on the language. And some of those exchanges in the comments section are so rewarding, interesting, fascinating. And you do have to get to a point where you say, okay, we've disappeared down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Both of us are too close to this, and move away.
Yeah. Would either of you like to add anything?
No, I completely agree, and I think that exchange in the margins is always, the best part of editing translation. I'm just thinking back to some of the comments in it's like, when you see those snapshots of words that exist in another language that don't exist in English at all, and then the translator's job is to find out how to translate it into English, and you see their thought process. It's just really, if you kind of love language, it's such a rewarding thing to be a part of, and and you just end up learning so much more about how people perceive things in different languages as well. And it kind of reminds you about the joy of being able to translate into English and really kind of stay true to the original while also making it something wholly different and its own thing.
I don't know why I'm tearing up as she's speaking. It's just really rare to find I don't know, editors so passionate about language and translation. I'm actually crying. Okay, this is not planned. So my follow-up question about editing was that I've noticed working from Arabic, and I think actually this has happened to some other colleagues also working from Spanish, that developmental editing now comes in before the actual line editing. So things like in the books that I've worked on, like heightening the sexual tension in a particular book, speeding up the narrative pace of a particular scene. Maybe for YA novels I've worked on, aging up the narrator because she's, the things that she's doing don't seem to be believable if she was actually that young. So I'm curious on the translations that you've worked on and have published or are upcoming. Have you ever veered into this realm of developmental editing where you've, have to do more than just look at the language? But yes, okay.
I was nodding encouragingly,
yes.
but
oh, okay. I thought you were like,
no, yes, but so rarely.
Okay,
so rarely, and I don't think I've ever done anything like you've just described.
Yeah.
I think maybe the most kind of interventionist I've been is suggesting cuts.
Okay,
like suggesting tightening in places. But we'll pass on to others.
Yeah, in my case as well, I think I have, with the agreement of the author and much
yes.
discussion, we have shortened some text, but it would be usually, we are publishing a collection of reportage in October, and the book won't be the same size as it is in Polish, because it's some of the pieces we felt were not necessarily as interesting to the British audience. But so it's that sort of. But yeah, at the moment, I don't think it's hard to change the text that already exists in a different language or in a few different languages.
And also to change a text that's already, if it's already been published in the country and readers have already responded to it, it's very difficult sometimes to say which bits you can change without changing the reading experience, which you haven't been a party to in the original.
Yeah, it's interesting. This has happened to me primarily more with bigger houses, I would say like Amazon Crossing, and with smaller houses when it's middle grade or YA. I see some people nodding, YA fiction. Because there's a very particular vision for what YA books should look like in the UK or in the US. Yes.
So that's really interesting, because I wonder if it's to do with a certain market or audience. Like with YA, maybe it doesn't translate in the same way to all languages, but then you're changing the fabric of the plot as well in a very specific way, whereas for more... I guess for some literary fiction, and if it's less plot, for example, less plot driven and more language driven, you're kind of careful not to change the fabric of the actual narrative. But yeah, it's really interesting because I've not come across that kind of reshaping characters and narratives. But as Ansa was saying, cuts, like, suggesting bigger cuts to the translator and then having the go ahead from the author to make those is always quite liberating, because sometimes languages don't. Like, we're publishing a Japanese novella next year by Naokola Yamazaki, and there's a lot of repetition because apparently, and the translator was saying in Japanese it doesn't read that way, or it just fits with the way that the language works and the kind of rules of the language, whereas in English it feels repetitive. And the author kind of came back and said, I trust you to just cut however much you want, which felt really liberating. Wow. Because we were like, obviously you're still true to the text, but you're cutting as much as possible for it to be kind of, it's that thing of prioritizing the English reading experience once it's been translated and making sure that the reader gets the most out of the book in English at that point in the process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. I was just curious, sorry, who is the translator for?
This translator, it's a bit. We've got two novellas, and Polly Barton is translating one, and Charlotte Goff is translating the other.
Okay.
But acquired at the same time from the same agent. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a nice. Me and the publisher Marigold at Daunt are kind of doing one each,
Okay.
and publishing on the same day.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Yes, Ansa.
No, I was just going to say a slightly different case, I suppose, would be non-fiction and translation. I've worked on a title in translation and non-fiction, and the lead time means that you're publishing 2 or 3 years after it was published in the original language.
Yes.
So, certain subjects have moved on. But in the case I'm thinking of, we worked with the author directly and said, what do you think about addressing this, like adding this line to show that, this conversation about this particular topic has moved on. And that was, collaborative and a small tweak.
No, that's helpful to hear. Thank you. Okay, just keeping, yes, eye on the time. Oh, yes, acquisition meetings, I think, is something that a lot of us are interested in. I personally have had books taken to acquisition meetings, and you're like, yes, it's made it to the meeting, and then, sometimes it doesn't go through, and sometimes it does. And so I'd like to hear more about what do acquisition meetings look like? Is that what they're called in your house? And what might be some of the reasons why a book might not make it through? If it's gotten that far, Yeah.
So at Daunt, they're I imagine very different to, I used to work at Penguin, and they were very different to the Daunt meetings. They're much more structured. But because we're such a small team, there's just 4 of us in the publishing team, and the Daunt publishing team is connected to the Daunt bookshops. And the way that it works is that head office are kind of a team of 3. They don't really have titles, but they run the bookshops, and they also act as our sales team. So everything that we do, whether it's a cover, getting that approved, or getting a book through acquisitions, it goes via them.
Wow.
But we don't really call it, it is an acquisitions meeting, but as you were saying, it's more informal than that. Like between myself and the publisher, if we love something, we'll share it with the team first, just between the 4 of us, and discuss it. And then if we all agree that it's good or it has potential, we then pitch it to head office, and then we'll kind of either phone them or go and see them if there's a few things to discuss and have kind of a really robust discussion about whether it works for us, whether it kind of fits with the rest of the list. And because they have a bookseller's perspective as well, because they're, running the shops, it's a really valuable asset in that way, because they're seeing they're kind of preempting trends in a different way, or they're seeing what has longevity, and also thinking about the Daunt list and what that means. And because it started as travel bookshops, often our books will have like a travel element to them, or a very strong sense of place, which is why translation is great, because you often get that perspective because it's in translation and set perhaps in a different country already. Right. And so it's a bit more informal than at other houses, but it's a very open kind of line of communication and discussion. And it means that you have maybe more freedom sometimes to offer for things that are maybe a bit more tricky, or that at a big house you wouldn't necessarily be able to have the go-ahead for, because it's a bit more niche. Or
what would be considered tricky?
Like if it's a book that is maybe a bit more obscure, or like overly literary, or doesn't have obvious kind of commercial success, but you really believe in it and think that it would stand out on the list, there's often room to kind of take a risk with that at Daunt, in a way that I've had colleagues, I used to be at Vintage, and I've had colleagues there, message me sometimes and say, oh, I wouldn't have been able to get that book through our acquisitions meeting, because you've got kind of sales, marketing, and loads of different departments involved, whereas for us it's just us going straight to head office. And I'd be interested to hear if you feel like sometimes I miss having that structure and all those other people to weigh in, but I wonder does it feel not prohibitive sometimes, but it's kind of it can go either way, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, I think, I suppose to skip forward to the part of your question about why do sometimes books not go through.
Yes.
I think by the time something gets to an acquisitions meeting, our old MD at Pam Macmillan used to say that it's not, the quality isn't in doubt. Like, we're not there to talk about the quality. You know, like they trust us that we wouldn't have editors wouldn't bring something to that meeting if it wasn't good enough to publish. But I would say the most common reasons why things don't go through are because we don't feel like we're the right publisher to bring it into the world. Because as Dredhëza says, it's a much bigger meeting. You have sales, marketing, publicity, the MD, the finance team. You know, everyone is there. Editors from other imprints. And it's there are so many people involved in publishing the book, and that's wonderful. It's amazing, you know, because when that enthusiasm's there, you've got a team around a book so early on, and it's really lovely. I love working in a team in that way. But if my old boss used to say that publishing is an ecosystem, and if a book isn't going to make sense coming from us, like coming into the world from our list, you know, there are certain like exquisite, beautiful literary titles that would just get lost on a list that also includes, you know, so I'm at Sceptre, which is part of Hodder, which has a big commercial list. So, you know, you're competing with space for those titles as well. So sometimes I think you just have to have a very kind of honest conversation along the lines of, this is wonderful, but we're not the right people to do this. And I think as an editor, it always makes sense to listen to your colleagues when they say that, because you can't publish a book on your own.
Yeah.
It would be really lonely and you'd be really unsuccessful. So I think at that point saying, okay, let's, I always say something like, okay, let's save our energy for one where we all feel committed, or something along those lines.
Yeah. And Tasja?
I mean, we are obviously very small, so it's slightly different. And I think in our case, things don't make it, even if we love something. And usually the initial agreement was the two of us have to love it out of three. And the third one has to see the merits. But then we publish, at the moment, we publish 5, maybe 6 books next year. So it's the sort of overall program, and that we think, we can't, even if there's something that's amazing in French, we've already done 2 books in French, so we should really make an effort with, other languages. So it's looking at what else we have and like for the moment, I think the books that we published are in conversation with one another, but at the same time, we need to maybe step away from that a little bit, because they're all intimate, female voices, quite short, quite intense, and because otherwise we will only be doing that. So I think how it fits within the program generally, and also just financial considerations. If it's very, very long, then it's very hard to do. It really needs to be a work of genius then. So.
Yeah. Okay. Moving on to translators in this whole sort of ecosystem, how much of a role do you expect translators to take? So now we've talked about acquisitions, getting it through, but translators' role in publicizing the book. And do you have a conversation with them beforehand? I have seen some translators where it's in their contracts, the expectations for publicizing, they must post a certain number of times on social media. You must make yourself available to travel to, within like however many miles of your home, things like that. I've found that terms around the publicity of literature and translation are becoming more sort of formalized, at least in my experience. I was keen to hear, what are your expectations of translators and publicizing the books that we love? Hopefully, yeah.
I mean, that's really interesting that some translators have that stipulated in their contract. I'm surprised by that. I don't know if you two are. That's why I hesitated, because I just thought, that's interesting. I would say we don't expect anything specific of our translators when it comes to the publicity of the book. It's more like if, again, going back to what their relationship is to the author too, sometimes it makes sense. Like when we brought Elisa Shuadusapan over for her book tour, because she's one of our biggest authors, we are able to kind of make a book tour for her, and she has so many loyal fans with each upcoming book of hers. For the last one, there were a couple of events where she was in conversation with Anisa Abbas Higgins, who is her translator, and it made for a really beautiful conversation and collaboration. And similarly, earlier this year, we had one of my colleagues' authors, Angelo Tysons. He wrote a book called The Edges, translated from it's a Flemish book, and Michelle Hutchinson translated it. So the two of them were in conversation together, and I really enjoyed it as a lover of language, and that kind of, if you are interested in that kind of thing, then it makes for a really fascinating conversation where they're talking about choices they made and conversations they had through the process, and it's a behind the scenes look. But again, it's not, I wouldn't say it's a requirement, it's more just a nice thing if both author and translator are up for it, and if there's appetite for that. But yeah, I'm really surprised. I don't know what you two think, but it's just interesting because...
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. I would say if you were taking a title to acquisitions or you were thinking of approaching a translator and you knew that translator was really happy and really comfortable to do events and had done lots of events, you would think, okay, wonderful. If an opportunity down the line comes up where they could do an event, they would probably be happy to do that. But I don't think we ever go into it with expectations or asking for a commitment. In some ways, I think it's probably quite similar to sort of expectations around what the author does, obviously a little bit different, but you always sort of start from the position of what it's our job to publicize the book.
Yeah.
And collaboration from the author is expected, and from the translator would be great, but I would never kind of expect it. But different publishers obviously have different models.
Mm. And I think there is also an element, a financial element in all of this, because of course the translator has done their job once they delivered the book, and then it's the edited text. And I'm delighted if they want to be involved. And I have had really good collaboration with lots of our translators, and some of them do events, and some of them. But for example, we can't always pay. We try to make sure that we factor in the fee for events in any sort of grant applications. But I also respect the fact that some of them don't like doing events, are not great at events, or just can't afford to be appearing without being paid. So I think there is it's this communication with the translator, because at that point they will be giving more than I think contractually they are obliged for. But it's lovely if they can, because in a way, if they're getting royalties, then I guess one assumes that the book will be selling more.
Mm.
But
yeah. Well, in the Q&A, I'd be keen to hear about other people's experiences and publicity. That's lovely to hear that, there isn't this expectation, and that, like, Ansa, as you said, like, it's our job, meaning like job of publishers, to publicize the books. Because unfortunately, that hasn't been my experience. So, yeah.
But at the same time, what we started doing, we have a Google document for us and a translator and whoever else is at that point involved in the life of a book, and we welcome the translators to add their ideas in there.
Okay.
So if they have an idea that somebody will be an excellent reviewer or give a good endorsement, it is a joint document, and it's again it helps to sort of generate ideas and have that conversation.
Yeah, very collaborative sort of approach, yes.
Yes, and I would ask, when we get the bound proofs in, the advanced reading copies, I would often ask the translator, is there anyone to whom you'd like me to send a copy? We produced some marketing material, some stickers for a title that I published. I sent some to the translator, not with an expectation that she'd do anything with them, but just because I thought she'd like to see them.
Yeah, stickers! Okay. What's one of the sort of greatest challenges? We've talked a lot about the joys of being an editor of translated literature, which is wonderful. But what are some of the greatest challenges of working with literature and translation? Maybe we can start with Tasja. Yeah.
Funding, I would say, sadly.
It's a good approach.
Because there are fewer and fewer places that give funding to independent publishing houses. I mean, but then there's country institutes still are very helpful, and also that the sort of enormity of the area that you're choosing from. That sometimes people come to us and say, or translators will pitch to us and say, this is a great book, and it's a country that I haven't been to, I haven't seen it, I haven't read any authors from. It's very hard for me to then say, yes, this is the best of what's available. So I find that we can't be experts in everything. I mean, in a way, that's why we have, we welcome pitches from translators, but it's the sort of enormity of the field, in a way, for me, as well.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming.
And also, some languages that maybe still there aren't as many translators for, or they're a bit more, I don't know if niche is the right word, but I'm from Kosovo, so my first language is Albanian, and since joining Daunt, I've really been hoping to find something from, translated from Albanian specifically, but in the Balkans in general, like Croatian, Bosnian, any of those languages, and there's just such a kind of lack of available I mean, there might be some here, in which case talk to me afterwards, but I think there's just either less appetite or it's more difficult to find those books to translate in the first place, because there's just not as much of a back and forth between publishers in these countries and the UK, in the same way that there might be between French publishers, Spanish publishers, and that's just, I mean, that's something that hopefully will change with more and more people and more interest, but similarly, it's just difficult with certain languages, and kind of, you then end up with kind of a deluge in one language and not another, and we can't be experts in everything, but then it's that constant, it's a desire to kind of keep finding those different perspectives and kind of finding someone to bring them to an English-speaking audience, but
yeah, no, it's just very encouraging to hear that you're actively seeking out that, those different perspectives and fresh talent, and that we have so many translators in this room who probably have some titles you might be interested in. But yes, Ansa, did you want to add anything about greatest challenges? We said funding, finding some other languages that we not usually worked with.
The thing I found most tricky is when you read a sample, you really, really love it, but you can't read the whole book. So then you send it off to get a reader's report, and the trusted reader comes back with a report, and if the report is good but maybe a bit mixed about the ending, and it could really go either way, and you can't read the original, and you have to turn it down because you have to say, I'm so sorry, if I could read the original and sit in front of my colleagues and say, this is incredible. And when you suspect that you might think it was incredible if you could read the whole thing, but there's obviously just that barrier.
Have you ever commissioned a second reader's report? I've had that happen to me, by the way. Yeah, where the editor couldn't make up their mind, and then they're like, let's get a second report because the first one was so mixed. Have you ever found yourself in that position? They still said no, by the way, but yeah.
That's such an interesting question. I have taken forward books where we had multiple readers' reports. But I don't think we just kept going until someone gave me the answer I was looking for. So I don't think I've done that.
Literary scouts are great for stuff like this too, because they'll just sometimes share, if you have a good relationship with them, they might share their reports or their thinking if they can read that language, and if you trust them, it's helpful to kind of have a second opinion or a pair of eyes. And also on the flip side of that, when you've only read 8 pages, like that book I was talking about, and then the full translation delivers and it's excellent, and you're like, okay, and it's kind of, you're relieved, because even though the Spanish was good, you never know if an English translation is going to kind of have, retain its kind of strength all the way through, and it's always a relief when that happens, but then it could go either way.
Either way. Yeah. Okay, let me quickly. Okay. Before we open it up, I'm going to ask one more question, so just giving you time to get your questions ready. So I think my final question is a pretty basic one, which is we're talking about samples, length of samples, 8 pages. Do you usually tend to prefer to see the sample from the beginning of the book, or would you want to see it from a point in the book where something, quite earth-shattering happens? I remember doing a sample for Penguin, and they thought the beginning was quite pedestrian, but they were still very interested in the book, and then asked me to do a second sample and commissioned me for a later part in the book, which was, I decided was where somebody gets murdered. So that was definitely much more, exciting. But I was just curious, does it matter? I mean, because as translators, we're always, going over these things in our heads about which part to do.
I find it quite disorienting if I'm starting in the middle of a book, even if it's a really exciting scene. So I think most of the time I do prefer it to be the beginning section, even if that feels less exciting. You get a feel for the texture of the style and the language, but I'm interested to hear what you guys think.
Yeah, I think it's usually the beginning, I think, or sometimes if there are multiple voices, someone might do the beginning and then do another part to give you a sense of that. Unless the beginning is something that's completely unrepresentative of the rest of the book. I'm publishing a book in English next year that begins with a job advertisement, like a very lengthy job advertisement, and it would sort of be, it'd be lovely to see that in translation, but it wouldn't be that helpful.
Right. Oh, that's a very helpful example. Tasja?
Yeah, I think sometimes it's useful if there is the beginning and then there is some chunk from later on, but it depends how many pages we are getting. So, I love getting long, chunky extracts, but, it's hard to expect that it's always possible.
Yeah. Okay, moment of truth. On to you. So yeah, if I think Heidi, you're kindly taking my microphone. And Sally. So yeah, just put your hands up, and then we could start here. I'll be pointing to you. So yes, with my wonderful one. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My question is about synopses. How long do you like to go? Because once I had a really complex novel, and I had to be talked down from doing like a 10,000 word synopsis. And I tried to bring it down to 2,000, but is even that too much? Thank you.
Okay, can you also give us your name and then the language you translate?
Oh yeah, sorry.
You translate from?
Yes, I'm Edra Karada, and I translate from Japanese.
Yes, probably shorter, but long enough that it makes sense. Yeah, obviously. But when they are too long, and then sort of my heart slightly sinks when because it's very dry when you read the synopsis usually. So.
I don't think 2,000 words sounds too long, though, because you want more than a blurb, right? Like it's not just, you want more than just the pitchy description.
I'd say like 2 pages maximum is how I'm envisaging. If I see more than 2 pages of a synopsis, I kind of dread reading it all. But you want to know what happens if you've only got the beginning, so enough to kind of give a sense of that. But it sounds like if the book was really long and complex, that sounds really difficult to condense. So there are exceptions.
Also, if it's a language that you're pretty sure that it's going to be unlikely that anyone in the commissioning team speaks, then a long synopsis might be all that people read. So that can be really helpful.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I translate from French and German. I have 2 mini questions. So if you have received a pitch or like a cold pitch from a translator or perhaps an agent, is there anything specific that has really stood out, that has made it really stand out, or that would stand out? The second is, if you already mentioned the Albanian book, but if you could publish your dream book, what would it be?
Okay. So I think when I receive cold pitches from translators, what normally makes it stand out is, I mean, you develop a relationship of trust, I think, with translators. If you know that your taste overlaps with theirs, and market information is so helpful and everything. But actually, I think the thing that grabs my attention is if a translator says, "I think this is brilliant. Like I really, really loved this," which is something. It's sort of similar to readers' reports as well. People are so can do such an incredible job giving you a sense of the plot. But I also just want to know whether you thought it was incredible. And then I don't know. I feel like I might have published my dream book. I published a book called Catch the Rabbit by a Bosnian author called Lana Bastasic, translated from Serbo-Croatian by the author, and I just loved it. Like I published it at Picador, I don't know how many years ago now, but I'm still talking about it and plugging it. It's about a young woman who goes back to Bosnia because her best friend, who she hasn't spoken to since they were children, has told her that her brother, who disappeared just towards the end of the conflict, has reappeared, and they set off on this road trip across Bosnia, and it's interspersed with sections from when they were teenagers growing up in the 90s, and it's just it's funny, darkly funny, it's beautiful on language, friendship, but it's also really incredible on what it's like to grow up where there's been a genocide and the effects of that on the people and the language and memory, and it's incredible.
Basically, Ansa's published my dream book already.
Available at all good bookshops.
Hello, my first name is Nielsine, and my last name is Nielsen, and I translate from Danish. So I wanted to ask about Cosmos by Lucia Udum, because she is pretty famous in Denmark. She's a very iconic podcaster. So this is sort of a question to you, Dredhëza, but also just for everyone. How much does the fame of the author or the renown or how well known they are, does that play into your choices?
Thank you for your question. That's a really interesting one because, when I kind of was looking at her author profile before acquiring the book, I was like, wow, she's a pretty big deal in Denmark, and kind of went down a rabbit hole, and she's written some really brilliant pieces in her podcast and everything. But if I'm honest, I wouldn't say that influenced the choice at all, not in a good or a bad way. It just, that fame doesn't necessarily translate across to here, but it more made me think, it made me feel excited to kind of, be in touch with her and talk with her about how the book came about. And she seems like such a fascinating personality. And because it's a really good example of an author whose book is in translation, but her English is so good that she really wants to be involved in the translation and editing process of that, which creates kind of an extra layer to the whole thing because, when you have an author with a great grasp of English, they have certain ideas of what they want their book to read like in English, and that kind of plays into the conversation a lot. So we've had a lot of back and forth about that, but that kind of, the fame part didn't influence the decision. It was more just the nice kind of perk, knowing that she's so beloved in Denmark and kind of is a brilliant writer, clearly, and has all these kind of ideas and things. So, I don't know if that answered the question or, yeah.
This side of the room. At the back, yeah.
Hi, I'm Kristen Gehrman, and I'm leading the Literature from Flanders workshop. My question is maybe a hard one, but I would like to know how committed are you to the human translator in the era of AI? And do you use machine translation and AI to help you assess books in other languages?
At Daunt, we have quite a hard line of not using any AI I say at the moment, ever, to be honest. I think as a team, we're all pretty against it. And I've actively kind of gently said no to considering agents' pitches that have told me that they've used kind of AI to help translate, just because I think it goes against a lot of what I'm not saying that's right for everyone. I know each publishers do things differently, but for us, I think because we're so small and because of our list and how lean of a list we have and how the way we work, it just feels really against our entire kind of ethos. To be using AI almost feels like it goes against the grain of how we work. I know that it will inevitably kind of become more and more prevalent, but for now, our kind of line is, as much as we can, we're resisting it and trying to kind of, bat it away, even if agents are... I appreciate when an agent I really love and whose taste I really share recently said to me, full disclosure, this sample translation, I found out after I kind of took it on that generative AI had been used to help translate it, and I really appreciated that candor because, it kind of made me really consider that in my reading as well. But the short answer is, at Daunt, we're really against any kind of use of AI and are fully committed to human translators. So it's nice to see so many here.
Yeah, absolutely. We fully committed to human translators. Occasionally, we have, when somebody, that we would never accept a pitch from an agent with an AI translation. If we sometimes love something and somebody read it in the original, we have good readers' reports, etc., we might ourselves look at the artificial translation just to see, instead of a synopsis, basically. But at the same time, usually it's really hard to... It's never helped us buy anything, to be honest. So it was quite a futile exercise in a way. Because it doesn't reflect the voice. It's just not enough.
Yeah, never bought anything where the sample was translated from using AI, never taken anything forward, never considered at all doing anything other than working with a human translator.
I'm Eva Tind, and I'm a writer from Denmark in the Danish workshop. And I have a couple of questions that's a little bit technical maybe, but how much does it affect, like if you buy a book, does length has a saying? Like it's more expensive to translate a long book? Is it more like you're translating more shorter books? Is that like easier to sell? And that's one thing. And the other thing is, I just recently changed to another agent, a Swedish agent, and they're actually sometimes doing full-length translations before they're sold. So would that like be better than just you getting 10 pages or 30 pages? Or how much would you prefer to have? Like, is 30 better than 10? Or is full length actually, does it matter at all? And the third thing is, in Denmark, the receptions has also really gotten into a field of people just reading kind of, before it was more experts, and today it's more like opinions. And so would it be good to, instead of have like a long, kind of pitch, would it be better to translate a reception, for example, from the papers? So because that's also a reading. That's what 3 questions.
Yes, I guess, again, it's probably quite unusual because we are new, and so there's a lot of sort of initial cost. So actually we are trying not to... I think we have one book that's about 300 pages, but generally it's the costing between the cost of the translation and the cost of printing. It just makes it prohibitive. It means that we would not at any point, earn out. Nobody says about making any profit there. I know that we bought one book from Croatia, which was already translated. And it was a debut book. It came from a publisher called Fraktura, and they commissioned a translation in Croatia. Then the translation was edited here, and it did help because we could read the whole book before publishing. I think the tricky thing there is that if you don't love the translation, then you might have to commission the translation again. So it's a little bit tricky, but.
Yeah, I think being able to read the whole book is helpful. I think the more material you have in a language you can read is helpful. But the issue, I think, is always funding. We see full translated manuscripts from countries where there's been a lot of investment in translation. So, for example, the Nordic countries. So we see a lot of full translations, but then it's completely understandable that from other countries where there's not that arts funding to translate things before they're sold, that there would be less material available, and that makes sense.
The only thing to add to that specific point about kind of cost and length and that correlation is that's often when it is really nice if you do have kind of a US publisher, for example, come in and you can split the translation cost between the two of you. Like, it makes a huge difference to both your bottom line, I guess. So that's something that's always really nice if you're able to, either if there's already a US publisher and you come in after, or the other way around, that really helps. But yeah, generally I think if it's a really long book, as you were saying, the cost is just kind of astronomical with the printing and everything else. And I'm trying to think, did we answer all the...
No, I think the last part was about translating reviews, which is actually always really helpful, actually, even if it's just a couple of lines from the coverage that happened when it was published.
And also, I tend to go on Goodreads if the book has been published in its original country and kind of just look at what people are saying on there. And I really, reader reviews are really useful always, as well as reviews from kind of newspapers and broadsheets and things like that. So yeah, always really helpful to have that.
Even if they're incredibly short, because it can really give you a sense of the tone or what people got out of it.
And also, what we do is check with other publishers that we know have similar tastes and compare what they are publishing. So if a given author is published in a few languages by publishing houses that we respect and the tastes are similar, then this would be often an element that would be in favor.
Oh, it's so difficult. Okay, at the back.
Hi, I'm Hongyu Jasmine. I translate with Chinese and English. I have a question in response to earlier when we were talking about how a mixed readers report might essentially, sadly, kill a pitch. And I, personally speaking, I have very passion projects, and assume many translators here have their babies projects. And I feel like hearing that makes me feel a little extra anxious about preparing a pitch and making it, as well as the sample, to make it really spot on. And I wonder about a reader's report's dependency on an individual's taste, and in the case when a mixed report comes up, is there the possibility for editors to reach out to the translators, even though considering the unpaid labor of doing translation samples is also an issue, but even just to ask them, perhaps in Ansa's, your example, the ending, could you, from the report, we get this negative review on the ending, could we talk a little bit more on that, or are you open to doing just a few more pages from the ending so we could get a better sense? I wonder if that could be a possibility. Thank you.
Yeah, I can totally imagine that would be a possibility. So if I've understood correctly, you're talking about the scenario where the translator has sort of cold pitched it to us rather than us having paid for a sample translation. Yeah, I mean, I think if you really love the sound of something and you think you might love it and you get a mixed readers report, you would always try and have as many conversations as you could before saying that it was a definite no, with the awareness that you're asking somebody to do extra work on top of what they've already done, even if it's the question of, you know, an additional phone call on top of it.
Hi, I'm Quaid. I translate from Dutch to English, working with Kristen. And I have a question regarding genre and the role that genre plays in the selection of books. So I guess I should begin by saying I have a bit of a prejudice. I have this assumption that maybe with smaller publishers, there's almost this tendency to favor like a really art house style read, and a lot of the books that I read or that I want to publish don't really fit that genre. And I'm just wondering, you know, is that assumption grounded in anything real? Should we have that fear going into it, or should we just go with it and trust that the book should get by on its own merits? I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Thank you.
I can see why there's that assumption for sure, just because, at Daunt, for example, our list is quite literary, but then within that there are different levels to it. So for example, my taste leans more commercial, whatever you take that to mean, than my colleagues, and it means that we have a really kind of varied range of books, both in English and in translation, where for me personally, I'm kind of looking, I think the book should stand on its own merit for sure, and for me, I just want to kind of feel connected to the characters, have a sense of immediacy in the voice, and also sincerity. I think with that art house style that you're describing, I often find that those books can read quite austerely and a bit, I feel quite distanced from the characters, so I don't always gravitate towards that, but it kind of depends what your definition of literary is and whether you're applying it to theme or style, or, you know, and for me, I think character is so important, and I just want to kind of be in love with the characters and their story, and for the writing comes first and foremost. I want good writing as well, you know, and that is so subjective, so I think the subjective part is what makes it difficult, I think, to define, and I don't think you should have a fear that you might not be able to submit to kind of more literary, smaller presses because you think they're after a specific kind of book. I think if you believe in that book and if your taste kind of coheres with the editors, then it'll find its right home. But that said, you know, there are genres that I don't naturally gravitate towards, so it kind of depends what genre it is. Like, I don't often love kind of sci-fi or historical fiction, but I love when agents send me stuff like that. I kind of always have a thing of, you know, never say never. You don't know what might surprise you, and I've been really surprised by books before that I thought by their pitch that I wouldn't love, but then I often will kind of skim the pitch, and then you start reading something and the writing either really grips you or it doesn't, and you kind of know quite quickly, I think. I don't know if you both agree, but...
Yes, it's also about the quality of writing. So if it's amazingly well written, but it has a sort of elements of horror or, I don't know, of sci-fi, and we don't do it normally, but you would think that it's an exceptional book, then certainly we would like to see it. But and to a certain extent, if you look at exactly what the publishing house publishes, you can see what, you know, where they are leaning towards. But
Sorry, can you just put your hand up again? Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Alexis, and I am an American translator of Dutch children's books, or at least I'm trying to be, emerging. Do British publishers consider, would you consider hiring American translators, or do you really have a strong preference for British translators?
We've definitely worked with American translators. Is there any obstacle to that? No. I mean, I suppose you get further down the line questions about, where you're doing the copy edit in terms of spelling, place name, words used for certain things, Do you say sidewalk? These are like such small examples, but like that would come out in the line edit. And I think what you'd end up doing is just highlight. I mean, the translator would know, right? And you'd trust them to use language that was right for the book wherever they came from, I think.
Hi, I'm sorry, I'm not a translator, but I'm a translation rights assistant at a literary agency. And two quick questions. I guess one is sort of like with the increase in popularity of literary translation, have you seen a rise in translators themselves being like traditionally represented by agencies? And the other one is like more of a broader question. I'm not sure, like maybe if you can speak to like if you're seeing this like desire for a wider range of literary translation like in foreign markets and like the success of your books maybe in markets beyond the UK market, if you might be able to speak to that a little bit.
So the first part of your question, also I started my job as a rights assistant, so I feel immediate affinity for you. The first part of your question was about...
Translators being represented.
Yeah, I haven't encountered much of that at all. I mean, I know that it definitely happens, but so I'm starting from a point of being very less familiar with that, so I'll leave other people to talk about whether it's increasing.
Unhelpful, but I also can't speak much to that because I don't feel like I've seen it at all, which must mean it's not increasing. I don't know, you've worked in... It's really rare.
Yes, that's okay. It is on the rise, yeah. I have a few colleagues of mine who are represented by agencies, whether they're emerging or more established. So definitely there are more agents who are taking on translators and their work, yeah.
I mean, I don't know how... I know that the Society of Authors and the kind of translators subsect of that, like Anisa Abbas-Higgins, who I work with a lot, will often run her contracts with us by them, and they're an amazing resource to make sure that translators are, treated fairly. And the most recent instance of this is just adding in like an AI clause, which we're completely on board with. And I think that's what I'm seeing a rise in, more translators doing that and consulting on that, but not necessarily having agent representation. But that's interesting that you've noticed that more, and yeah.
And then the second part of your question, yes, I've seen markets for English language translations internationally. So for example, when I was at Picador, some of the titles that we published specifically translated from Japanese, I remember that they specifically did very well. For example, in India, they were very popular. And there was a sense that was something that readers there in certain parts of the country were looking for. And then Europe can be a really interesting market as well for titles in translation. You obviously get into the question then of when you're publishing English language editions in other countries where they might want their own translation, but that's kind of a separate issue.
Yes, it's exactly. There's this discussion now in publishing that people want to read in English directly. So countries where people speak very good English, the sort of translation sales are often cannibalized by the English language sales. So there is a big discussion about how to resolve that, but it's a sort of different discussion in a way.
This gentleman in the white t-shirt. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Bruno Pellegrino. I'm a writer. I write in French, but I also work as an editor for Editions Zoé in Geneva. So I was very happy to hear you to talk about Elisa Sawad Hussain and Gabriela Zalapi, since they are our authors. We have what we call in French an author's politics. I don't know if you can say that in English. So meaning when we read a manuscript, like a debut by someone, then we will read the next manuscripts and try to publish the whole body of work of that person. I mean, in theory. Do you have that with translators or anything similar? Like if you work with a translator once and it works well, will you tend to work more with that person? And then a second question that's related. Has it happened to you that you get a pitch from a translator and you really like the book, but you don't like the way it's translated and you commission it to someone else? Because I've had the case recently and morally it's super complicated, so I'm really interested.
Great question.
I'll try and keep it short. To your first question, the kind of main example of that I can think of is, again, the Elisa Shuadusafan books, and she's had the same translator for the last 4 books, and it's a really beautiful collaboration that they have together, and we wouldn't kind of dream of going to a different translator unless there was a specific reason they wanted to do that. So I think when that happens, it's quite natural, and you can't really force it, but it's just that the two people work so well together. And then obviously you might have translators that you've worked with before on different books that you really trust and you like their style. So I would always keep them in the back of my mind, for example, for future projects. And then to your second question, remind me, you said it was about, I did have an answer, but now I've... Oh yeah. So yeah, that's difficult when it's the translators. I think the moral problem there is because they're submitting their pitch to you. Because when an agent does that, I have been honest with them and said, I don't love this translation, so if I were to buy this book, I would like to see another sample, if that's okay. Because I can see this happened for context recently with something in Spanish, and the only reason I knew is because our publicist was able to read the Spanish, and I could see that it was good, but there was something off with, there were 2 translators attached, and one was just a bit better, but then there was still something a bit off. So I would then ask to kind of commission a new translation sample, if possible. But when it's the translator directly, I think it's tricky because they've come to you with the project. So I'm not really answering it very well, but I don't know how you'd approach that sensitively. I mean, you would obviously try and be...
It would be very complicated, and I don't know whether at the end I just would reject the book, exactly, rather than complicate. Yeah,
an industry of people pleasers. I think I would unless I really. I think I would reject it to avoid the conflict unless I really loved it and like.
Yeah, I would probably do the same. I have never encountered that situation. I know of a case where somebody did commission a second sample. So they got the pitch with a sample and they commissioned another sample. And I think it was really difficult because it's a small world.
Never get this opportunity again. They're very busy. You try to come to them up like London Book Fair, people eyes will be glazed over. Okay, yes, let's go. Put your hand up here. I'm telling you.
Thank you. I'm Alice, I translate from French. And I actually have more of a clarification than a question. You were talking earlier about adding translators' notes. And how that could actually be really interesting for you, which surprised me. I think it surprised a lot of us here. So that was really great to know. But I can't remember now whether we were talking about when you're in the editing process or whether it's really at the point where it's the sample that's in the pitch. Are you saying that you're open to translators having a commentary on the translation in the pitch and the sample itself?
What I was envisaging, and it was a broader thing we were talking about, so I will hand this over, but was when the full translation delivers and less of a kind of, constant commentary throughout the whole thing, but with, the occasional comment throughout to explain choices or any particularities of how it reads. I think that would be more useful when the full translation delivers. Otherwise, that's asking a lot of work of you when you're producing a sample that's probably going to be read fairly quickly. But
I think that's.
Yes, at the back, and then we'll come to.
Hi, Nina Woodson. I translate Dutch to English. We were talking about AI earlier, and a colleague of mine said she'd seen in the UK that publishers were broadcasting the fact that their translations were not AI, like human translated. And I wondered if you'd seen that, or if that's been taken into consideration as an idea to do.
Like having it on the cover?
Yeah, like in the marketing material and a little something about, human whatever, crafted or something.
I suppose it's interesting because, we would put the translator's name on the cover, we would include the translator's bio in places. So yeah, like recognizing the translator, but I would sort of be doing that as a matter of course. And it's interesting because it's almost that sounds like a celebration of human translation, but then it's also edging towards a place where that feels like something to point to as like a particularity, and that's not, I hope that's not where we are.
Though there is an agency, I think, isn't there, that was set up recently that was a publishing house that said that they were publishing books with AI translation. It was a whole article in the bookseller. So, and this is a unique, this is the first example of it, but clearly there is, something, things might come up more.
Yes, for clarity, she's in the striped shirt. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Claire. I translate from Korean. Thank you so much for this really, really insightful panel. There was so much I took away from it. My question's probably quite a difficult one to answer, but I want to ask it because I think a lot of people will be wondering. It's about cold pitches from translators. I think it's quite difficult when we're the ones pitching the work. It's quite difficult to know because if we can cold pitch to a publisher, because it will say on the website, no unsolicited submissions, which seems to be directed at authors. It says the publishers take submissions from agents, but it's never quite clear for whether that means that it's okay for does the translator count as an agent or not, because it's kind of in a grey area. And I also very aware that editors have so many emails in their inbox, and it must be almost impossible to begin to keep up with all these submissions. So I'm also speaking from experience of having cold pitched to editors and having books acquired, so I know it happens as well. So when we're thinking about one of our translators asked me, I don't know how much to encourage them to cold pitch, because I know that it does work sometimes, but then I know a lot of times the editor probably won't even get a chance to read it in many cases. This is a long preamble to ask, do you take cold pitches from translators? I know it's been kind of mentioned, and if you do, is there any advice or suggestions to make it easier for you, make things easier for you when receiving those cold pitches? Is there a good time of the week or a good time of the year to receive those cold pitches? And is there anything that makes you more likely to choose to read that pitch rather than another cold pitch?
Thank you.
We do. At Linden, we do. And it says, our website says, well, that translators are welcome to pitch books, so send them along.
Yeah, I mean, I receive them, and they're usually from translators that I've worked with before, been in touch with before, or happen to meet. I am very aware that it's often unpaid labour that's coming my way. And also understand it's how a lot of translators find work. It's funny, I had this conversation about when's the best time to receive pitches. I had this conversation with an agent, because very similar things come up. I think we were actually talking about like when in the year is a good time. And I think it's impossible to guess, to kind of look down the line and think of all the different factors that could come into play. And it's usually almost always talking very personally. You do it on a triage system. Something comes in, you read, some of the email, and if you think yes, immediately that sounds like something for me, you will engage then. If you think, oh, I don't know, it sounds like it's very good, but it doesn't feel urgent, you might not engage then and hope to come back to it. So yeah. That's a very woolly answer, but hopefully helpful.
Yeah, I agree with what you've both said. I think I can see how it's confusing because publishers do say they don't accept unsolicited submissions, but I would say from translators there is an exception because, as Ansa was saying, like it's often that's the way you're working and trying to find work and you're not represented by agents, and I will always welcome pitches from translators who I can see have taken the time to kind of look at the list and pitch something that they genuinely think would suit the Daunt list or maybe my own taste, or there's like a kind of shared sensibility there. And in terms of like how to grip us because of all the kind of other pitches, I'd say kind of make the most of the fact that you're not an agent submitting and make your email, it doesn't have to be, I think the structure of agent pitches is so specific and we're used to it, and I often just do skim it and go straight to the material. And as Ansa was saying, it's kind of that system of something really speaks to you, so you start with that, and you kind of, there's not always an obvious rhyme or reason. It might just feel, you might just be more excited by that than something that you got earlier that week, and it's to do with what you're in the mood for. But as a translator, I'd say don't be afraid of making the email sound really personal, saying why you love the book, and just, it doesn't have to be so formal. Like so much of this is about taste and whether you love the writing. So often, even if a book's done incredibly well in its country and has all this praise, if you don't love the writing or don't believe in the translator's love for it, it's not gonna kind of be enough. So yeah, don't be afraid to just go right in with why you're passionate and just, introduce yourself, and yeah. But yeah, we'll definitely accept those pitches.
I think it's a really encouraging note for us to end on, the human element of pitching. Yes, and I would love for us to give a round of applause to all of our guests today. Thank you. Yeah, that's all we have time for. But thank you for your fantastic questions, and see you around.
Thank you.